Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our series on the most important battles in the Civil War. We're looking at Chickamauga and Chattanooga, which is number 8 on our list, even though these are two separate battles, they're often grouped together. In the last episode, we looked at Gettysburg, which many people call the turning point of the Civil War. James and I discussed why that's not exactly the case, because the Civil War is so big and so expansive that you can't really pin it on one event. But one thing we can say that's different is the Confederacy no longer feels this sense of invulnerability that it once did, and perhaps its feelings of invulnerability were what caused the mishaps at Gettysburg in the first place. Anyway, what we're going to see in these two battles is something very interesting. It seems that the Union is plagued by mishaps in the early Civil War. It's moving too slow. Its generals are constantly wrongly calculating, wrongly guessing what enemy force numbers are. And could such mishaps happen to the Confederacy? Well, we're going to see what happens here. So, James, let's jump in. What is the strategic situation in the East after Gettysburg?
Okay, we'll wrap up the East, and then we're going to put the East on pause for a while, and we're going to talk about the West for the next several episodes, or at least 2 or 3. As you said, we'd had Gettysburg. Gettysburg was a major Union victory. It was the end of Lee's campaign, his second campaign to try to invade the North. But not a whole lot happens. It wasn't really this big, massive, decisive battle. We're going to see later on that Robert E. Lee and his army are still alive and well. They're alive and kicking, as the phrase says. They're going to be around for quite some more time. They're not packing it in by any means. After the battle, Meade had kind of made a little bit of an effort to harass Lee as he was retreating, but not much. He didn't have a full-fledged pursuit in which he chased after Lee and tried to track him down and destroy him and the army. That was very disappointing to many in the North, and Lincoln too, but then Lincoln finally understands, and we've said this again and again, but it bears repeating, that oftentimes an army is just as exhausted from victory as they are from defeat. You're fighting just as hard. In fact, maybe that's part of why you're winning. So you can't just go down and act as if you've been sleeping well and eating well for a long time. You've got to rest. Both sides have to rest and recover. So Lincoln tells Meade pretty much to hold his position. He was to threaten Lee primarily just by being in a threatening position, not so much by attacking. But don't attack. No major attack is going to occur. And there's going to be a few minor engagements between Lee's and Meade's armies over the next few months, but for the most part, the Virginia front is quiet, and it's going to take a back seat to the west. And things are going to be so quiet, in fact, that the Confederacy is going to be able to shift some troops around. In fact, Jefferson Davis is going to order that 2 divisions in the Army of Northern Virginia, of course, that's Lee's army, he's going to send them west to reinforce the Army of Tennessee, which is led still at this time by General Braxton Bragg. They are camped out in North Georgia, so that's where we're going to pick up the action.
Right, and then that back and forth over which troops go, where do they go, how are they deployed, and whether or not the right choices were made is going to come into play later. But one thing that we left off after Gettysburg is that almost exactly at the same time that the end of Gettysburg happens, there's also the end of the siege of Vicksburg. So what's happening in the West after Vicksburg?
Okay, so we'll go way out to the Mississippi. As we saw in a previous episode, when Vicksburg fell, not long after that, Port Hudson, Louisiana fell, and that completely put the Mississippi River in Union hands. Grant and other Union leaders are now that they've got control of the Mississippi and they've cut the Confederacy in two, they're not really sure what to do next. There's several options available. One option would be to focus their efforts in the Trans-Mississippi region, meaning across the Mississippi on the west side. Today we would call it the Arklatex. My wife is from Texarkana, and always when I'm up there, they're always talking about, this is the best deal on the Arklatex. So that would be Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas.
Wow, that's the first I've heard that. Nice.
Yeah, Arklatex. Anyway, it is an important part of the Confederacy. It is kind of on the fringe. But it's important certainly in the sense that they were able to export. Export's not the right word, I guess, because it's the same country, but they are providing a lot of cattle and sugar and other critical supplies for the Confederate armies. Now that's going to be pretty much gone. They could also, the Union Army had the option of concentrating on the Gulf states, maybe going down and working on establishing full control over the state of Mississippi, maybe working on Alabama and gradually working your way toward Georgia, especially on the Gulf Coast. So what are they going to do? Grant and Nathaniel Banks, remember, he's one of these political generals who is pretty modest in his abilities, not much of a general, but he was the hero of Port Hudson. He led the force that captured Port Hudson, the very last Confederate fortress on the Mississippi to fall. Grant and Banks wanted to attack Mobile, Alabama, which was the last major Confederate port left in Confederate hands on the Gulf of Mexico. Halleck is still in command. Well, actually, Halleck is the general-in-chief now. He had replaced General McClellan as the top general in the entire Union Army. He'll hold that for a little while longer. He wanted to focus on the Trans-Mississippi. He thought that Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas could be just completely knocked out of the war. Lincoln agreed with Halleck. He takes Halleck's sides. He wanted Texas's cotton. And there was an international aspect to the problem as well, because France had invaded Mexico. And France had set up a puppet emperor, brought this German guy over and said, "Congratulations, you're now the emperor of Mexico." Oh, it's good work if you can get it. But Lincoln wanted to make sure that France is not going to help the Confederacy by its control over Mexico, bringing in supplies that way through the back door, so to speak. And Lincoln also thought that Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana could be quickly brought back into the Union if federal troops invaded them. There was quite a bit of Union sentiment in parts of these states. There was a little bit in Louisiana. There was quite a bit of Union sentiment in Texas, especially in the Hill Country and in the Dallas area. Well, today we would call it the Metroplex. Back then it wasn't a Metroplex at all, but in northern Texas and in the hills of Arkansas as well. So Lincoln wanted to capitalize on that. So Lincoln decides that Banks is going to lead an invasion of Texas. And by the way, note to listeners, never invade Texas. You always lose.
It's the Russia of the Western Hemisphere.
That's right. As a proud Texan, I'm here to say that it's just not a good idea. But Lincoln didn't understand that. So Banks is under Lincoln's plan. Banks will invade Texas, and Grant will push Joseph Johnston eastward out of Jackson, Mississippi, where he was still, and toward Georgia. Joseph Johnston, we've seen him popping all over the place. He's been, he was at First Bull Run, and he's been here, he's been there. Johnston is now in charge of Confederate forces in the West. He is the top Confederate general. Bragg is under him. Anyway, Grant's job was going to be to eventually clean rebel forces out of West Mississippi to shore up federal control of the Mississippi River, just to make sure we've got firm control, not just of the river itself, but all the land around it. Now, Grant put Sherman in charge of driving Johnston out of Jackson. I know that's confusing. Johnston, Jackson. This is the city of Jackson, Mississippi. And another job that Grant gives to Sherman is to tear up Confederate railroads in Mississippi, which Sherman loves doing that. Sherman loves tearing stuff up. He's, put me in. I want to do it. And Sherman does a great job of this in really destroying the infrastructure of the Confederacy, not completely, but destroying parts of it, critical parts, and making it harder for the Confederates to get supplies from point A to point B, as well as troops. I want to mention one thing in passing. This is going to become a major deal during the March to the Sea later on when we talk about that. But there was a phenomenon called Sherman neckties. And what happened is the Union troops under Sherman would cut a railroad. They just tear it up, and they would take part of the actual metal that made the rail, and they would heat it up really hot, and then they would twist it around. Sometimes they'd twist them around trees. Other times they would just leave them in place and twist them, or just kind of throw them off to the side. But they kind of looked like neckties, so they called them Sherman neckties. So I think that's kind of a funny little trivia thing of the war.
Yeah, they're going to be all over the place, the March of the Sea. One question with that. So Sherman is known for this total war, destroying infrastructure. Who's the author of this policy? Is it Grant? Is it someone else?
Well, it's something they just gradually came upon as we talked about during the Vicksburg campaign how supply lines were so important, how Grant and Sherman at that time followed the traditional military doctrine, if you will, that when you go and invade another country, you bring your supplies with you and you have to keep an open line of supplies. But as Grant and Sherman were marching around, through the rich southern countryside, and they saw these big farms and these big plantations with lots of cattle, lots of wheat, lots of fruit and vegetables and all kinds of things. They said, we could have that for ourselves. We don't need to bring supplies. We'll just help ourselves to the local the local produce, treat it like a restaurant, so to speak. And so I'm not sure that there was a single author of it. It was just something that kind of came to them. Grant and Sherman, I believe, decided on it at about the same time.
All right. Well, there we go. That is the West after Vicksburg. Now, today we conflate a lot of the South together, but back then they were working on a more granular level of what the South was. So another part of the South is Southeast Tennessee and North Georgia, which is another theater. So what's happening in this theater?
All right. This is going to be where a lot of the action is going to be in late 1863. The major Union Army in this theater, we would kind of call this the middle of the country, at least by the standards of that time. It's not the East Coast, but it's not the far west either. It's not over to the Mississippi. We're talking about East Tennessee, North Georgia. The major Union Army is Rosecrans' Army of the Cumberland, and they were stationed just outside of Chattanooga. We saw in a previous episode that prior to that, the Confederates were in Chattanooga and under Bragg, and Rosecrans was north of there. But Rosecrans actually led a brilliant campaign of maneuver, just constantly flanking. Napoleon would have been proud.
There we are, Napoleon.
Yeah, there you go. But y'all don't take a drink because Scott has to say it.
Sorry, everyone.
Oh, you can if you want. But in this Tullahoma campaign, Rosecrans had used deception and used flanking movements and everything except a lot of head-on combat. And he had driven Bragg completely out of Tennessee and into northern Georgia. So he's just south of Chattanooga, but he's in the state of Georgia at this point. Now, Lincoln wanted General Rosecrans to continue driving Bragg southward. He feared that Johnston, who was in Jackson, Mississippi, and Bragg might unite their forces and possibly reconquer part of Tennessee. Lincoln was really eager to have Tennessee brought back into the Union as quickly as possible. So he tells Rosecrans, continue to drive Bragg. Keep doing what you're doing. You're doing a great job. But Rosecrans slows down. Again, one of these plodding Union generals. He had just gotten through with a brilliant campaign, but it's like, he's tired and he doesn't want to move anymore. So he's very, very slow. And it was late July 1863. Oh, man, I just had a Johnny Cash moment. You know the song, The Boy Named Sue?
Of course.
It was Gatlinburg in late July. That just came into my mind. All right, sorry, listeners.
Empty bottle of beer. Yeah.
That's right, yeah. It wasn't too far from Gatlinburg, actually. But anyway, so it was late July. Rosecrans begins to move. And at the same time as this, Lincoln had ordered our good old buddy Ambrose Burnside, the man with the epic facial hair who gave his name to sideburns. Burnside, we saw, had been temporarily, or at least for a while, elevated to the command of the Army of the Potomac, but he was an awful commander. But he was pretty good at a lower level of command. So Burnside doesn't get just completely shoved out of the service like McClellan does and some of the other generals. Burnside is back in control of a corps, and he goes, actually, it's kind of a small army, a big corps, and he takes them to Knoxville, Tennessee, which is in northeast Tennessee. And that was, we've talked about this before, that was a big hotbed of unionism. Those people did not want to leave the Union, and they would cause a lot of trouble for Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy. Lincoln wanted to liberate them, and he had been wanting to do this for quite some time. Well, Burnside is successful. He captures the city on September 3rd of 1863. So, and again, we saw that Rosecrans maneuvered Bragg out of Chattanooga without a fight. And September 9th, Bragg has to abandon Chattanooga. This is a major Union accomplishment since the city was of great importance. Chattanooga was a major rail center, important key supply depot for the Confederates. And this means that now, in fact, at least 90% of Tennessee is in Union hands. You've still got some cavalry groups like Forrest and General John Hunt Morgan and some others that are running around causing a little trouble. But for the most part, Tennessee is now in Union hands, and it's going to stay in Union hands. All the major cities certainly are Union controlled. Now, Bragg has to retreat into Georgia, as I've already mentioned, and he'd been pushed back more than about 80 miles.
Well, one other thing I want to mention here is that some of these challenges that the Confederacy is facing at this moment has to do with someone who's going to mostly remain in the background for this episode, which is Robert E. Lee. And what we said at the top of this episode, questions about how forces are going to be deployed. Lee was maybe politically weakened a little bit by the Gettysburg defeat, but he wanted to delay Longstreet, the Confederate general, to delay his movement out of the Virginia theater. And here's how this relates to what we're going to talk about here in a second with Chickamauga. So in August, Longstreet is asking the Confederate Secretary of War, and he's pressing Lee also to send his troops west because of everything that's happening out there. So Bragg warns Richmond of a massive offensive by Rosecrans and Burnside and requests reinforcements. So Lee summoned to Richmond on August 24th to discuss the situation in Tennessee and Georgia. And then at the end of August, Davis begins discussing with Lee the possibility of Lee providing reinforcements to Bragg. But Lee argued that Union reinforcements on his front would preclude transfers from his army. But now he's arguing that transfers away from Meade on the Union side that's facing Lee in Virginia, it made Meade's army vulnerable to an offensive by Lee's full army. So that's Robert E. Lee for you, just always thinking of the offensive opportunity. So he even ordered Longstreet to prepare for an offensive on August 31st. So Davis and Lee are, I guess you could say dithering, but the situation is really changing out here in the West. So like you said, Burnside takes Knoxville, and he cuts the rail link between East Tennessee and Virginia, and other critical rail lines and transport lines. Longstreet's two divisions, which didn't begin to leave central Virginia until about September, the second week of September, they had to take the long route to Chattanooga because of these lines being cut off on 10 railroads instead of just traveling a much shorter distance. And each of Longstreet's units took 8 to 10 days to reach Chickamauga, and many of them didn't get there till about the last 2.5 days of battle. So anyway, that's some other things that are happening there in the background on these other fronts. But troop movements, if you love that information, there you go.
Yeah, it's really difficult for the Confederacy because in one aspect, they want to send guys out to the West to help General Bragg. It's pretty clear that Meade's not going to do much. But if you weaken Lee's army too much, then you're going to tempt Meade to actually do something in Lincoln, of course. So it's a difficult balancing act. The Confederacy is almost always outnumbered. We've talked about this before. And Lee's a gambler, and Lee is not afraid to put himself in a situation where he's even more outnumbered because of these Union commanders. It's almost as if he can read their minds, and he knows what they're going to do. And he knows that in general, they're just not very aggressive. They're not like him. They're not like Stonewall Jackson or Longstreet. They're cautious. So that enables Lee to roll the dice a little bit and weaken his forces in the hopes of getting an advantage in another part of the battlefield, or in this case, in another part of the whole country. All right, so let's go back out to Bragg's army. He is going to get these reinforcements from Longstreet, as you mentioned, but as you also mentioned, it's going to take forever for them to get there because they have to go this really crazy long way out of the way because of Union control of certain areas and because of railroads being cut. Bragg is south of Chattanooga, as we mentioned, and he deploys his army along a meandering creek called Chickamauga Creek. And supposedly that means River of Death. Now, I do have to say this. It's kind of funny. A couple of the sources that I've been using throughout this series are very skeptical about that.
So ominous.
Yeah, it's Chickamauga. Like, it just increases the drama, right? The River of Death. Professor Gary Gallagher, who's at the University of Virginia, he did the teaching company course on the Civil War, which I highly recommend. If you want a really in-depth Civil War course, that's what you want to listen to. But he's very skeptical. He says, I don't really think that's what it means. And Shelby Foote, who of course is departed now, but Shelby Foote wrote one of the definitive works on the Civil War called The Civil War Narrative. And boy, I tell you what, that is thousands and thousands of pages, 3 volumes, each averaging about 1,000 pages. That if you really, really, really want to learn every single thing about the Civil War, pretty much, that's your book. Shelby Foote was also one of the main guests on the Ken Burns miniseries, which I recommend for people who would like to learn the Civil War but don't want to read 3,000 or 4,000 pages. But he says on there, yeah, they said it means River of Death. I think all Indian words mean River of Death. It's kind of funny. But. So anyway, we'll see if that turns out to be prophetic or not, that supposed meaning. So Rosecrans is coming south very slowly toward Bragg's army. He thinks the Confederate army of Tennessee, of Tennessee, it was spent. So he spreads out his army over a long arc. But he doesn't realize that Bragg, as we saw, that these divisions under Longstreet are starting to trickle in. He doesn't know that Bragg is actually planning an offensive. So he spreads his army out, which is not real wise. The Union High Command learns about Bragg's attack, but it's too late to send Rosecrans any reinforcements. So Meade is not going to be able to help. Rosecrans is on his own. Bragg is hoping to hit the isolated pieces of Rosecrans' army, and that's going to lead us to the battle itself.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. I invite you to come along for the ride.
War has played a key role in the history of the United States, from the nation's founding right down to the present. Wars made the United States independent, kept it together, increased its size, and established it as a global superpower. Hi, I'm James Early, host of the Key Battles of American History podcast. In each episode, I discuss American history through the lens of the most important battles of America's wars. To start listening now, go to parthenonpodcast.com or search Key Battles of American History on your favorite podcasting platform.
Once in a generation, a podcast comes along with the power and eloquence to inspire us all.
This show will entertain you while you wait for that one. Join two best friends, author and former history teacher John Driver and comedian Johnny W. for hilarious and authentic conversations about life, history, culture, faith, and everything in between.
You can listen to Talk About That wherever you find your podcasts or at lifeaudio.com.
All right, let's jump in. Let's get into the battle.
All right, let's do it. Bragg wanted to move his army around the army of Rosecrans. There's that flanking movement again. That could be another drinking thing.
Yeah,
flanking.
I mean, I'll just say the word Napoleon. So if anyone's sitting there by their hard apple cider and just waiting, there you go, my friend.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a movie about this part of the Civil War, so I won't get that word in too much. But anyway, he's trying to flank Rosecrans, get behind the Federals, and in between them and Chattanooga, and that would drive the Federals into a cul-de-sac and encircle them. He thinks maybe he can surround them completely. It's going to be very hard to do. It's pretty risky, but he's going to give it a shot. So on September 18th, there was a little bit of contact between the two armies, really just light skirmishing, but the battle doesn't begin in earnest until September 19th. And one of the first clashes is between our old friend Nathan Bedford Forrest. His cavalry runs into a Union infantry detachment. Both sides send reinforcements and the battle spreads and escalates. This is kind of like the first day of Gettysburg in reverse. At the first day of Gettysburg, it was a Union cavalry unit that ran into a Confederate infantry, and then both sides sent in reinforcements, and it turns in this big battle. But this is just the opposite. We start with Confederate cavalry versus Union infantry, but pretty soon both sides have everything. They've got cavalry, they've got artillery, and they've got infantry. Neither side gains an advantage from this first day. They fight for 12 hours, just back and forth, neither side gains an advantage. The first day is a tactical draw. Now, we've talked a lot in the past about how prior to some of the battles and during some of the battles, there's been a lot of rain, there's been muddy ground, it's just been a quagmire. This battle is the exact opposite. The ground is extremely dry due to a drought that had occurred, and the entire battlefield is just covered with clouds of dust. This was one of the battles in which it was very, very hard to see. Neither commander could see what the other army was doing, which makes it a challenge. And you had several divisions on the federal side, and I just want to mention an interesting piece of trivia in passing, that one of the federal division commanders was a man named Jefferson Davis. How about that? There were two Jefferson Davises. This is Jefferson C. Davis. No, I don't think he's related to the Confederate president. But anyway, so General Longstreet arrives that evening, the evening of the 19th. He got lost on the way to Bragg's headquarters. He doesn't arrive until 11 p.m. Bragg puts him in command of half of the army, the right, the Confederate right. And he gives Leonidas Polk, the former Episcopal bishop that we've seen before, he gives Polk command over the other half. And the plan is to hit the Federals all over the line, just to do a complete east to west attack. That evening, the temperature gets down to freezing, but both armies were forbidden to light fires so that they would not give away their position. So these poor men are just freezing, and they're thinking, gee, it'd be nice to have a fire, but they can't. Some people do win anyway, but for the most part, they don't. The next day is September 20th. Bragg orders Polk and Longstreet to attack early in the morning, but as often happens in the Civil War battles, it doesn't happen. There's delays for one reason or another. It takes time to get the men up and in the line. There's communication breakdowns. Communication breakdowns? Is that a word? Breaks down? I don't know.
Breakdowns.
Anyway,
yeah, sure, why not?
Breakdowns. Yeah. Okay.
It's not uncountable.
What we have here is a failure to communicate. But that's from Cool Hand Luke, by the way. So that is a movie, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say. So we can reference other movies. Doesn't have to be about this battle.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, whenever there's a good quote, I reserve the right to work it into the narrative here. All right, so the attack occurs late in the late morning, early afternoon. And what happens is a gap develops in the Union line. And this is kind of a crazy story. Rosecrans becomes convinced that there's a gap in the Union line. There wasn't one originally. There was no gap. But in order to correct this gap, he creates a gap in another place. And you never want a gap in your line. Of course, Scott and I have talked about how Civil War tactics worked, how you had these long lines, just big long lines of men, and you've got to keep them filled in. You can't have gaps. Otherwise, somebody will run through, cut you in half, and possibly surround you. So they got to fix this gap. Well, before they're able to fix the gap that was caused by thinking there was a gap, Longstreet, our old buddy Longstreet, he sends troops towards it. They punch a hole right through the line, and the entire right wing, which is about a third of the army, that's the Union right, so that is on the left side of the map. Okay, I didn't do a mental map. Sorry about that, folks, but just think of two east to west lines running from left to right. This is on, if you're visualizing the battlefield, let's say you're looking at it from above, this would be on the left side of the map. This is on the top. The Union is on the top, the north side, the Confederacy is on the south. But anyway, so Rosecrans' entire right wing on the left side, it's about a third of the army. They break and they run. And Rosecrans later said, I saw our lines break and melt away like leaves before the wind. So that's never a good thing. Rosecrans himself retreats. He leaves the battlefield. He just runs off and leaves part of his army there.
Dangerous. I mean, this is going all the way back to antiquity, that many people don't die on the head-to-head clash, but it's when you're routed and fleeing. That's when it happens. And Rosecrans himself, he's fleeing. And
Rosecrans makes a huge mistake here. He kind of freaks out and panics. You're supposed to stay with your army, but he doesn't. So Rosecrans and the Union right wing retreat all the way back to the outskirts of Chattanooga. The Federals have 8,000 men captured, 15,000 muskets, 51 cannons, and many other supplies. All these gone. Now they're in Confederate hands. But not every Union general is going to give up. No, sir. We're not throwing in the towel just yet, because the Union left which is the Confederate right, of course, and that's our right side if we're looking at this battlefield from above. There is a general there that refuses to give up. He is going to stick it out. He's going to stay and fight as long as he can, and his name is George Thomas. This is where he's really going to gain his fame. He's been with the Army for quite some time. Thomas rallies the remaining Federals into a strong defensive position. It becomes known as Horseshoe Ridge because of the shape and because it's a little bit elevated ground. And he keeps the Confederates at bay for several hours, even as they're starting to envelop him. He and his army finally realize they got to get out of there, so they retreat back north toward Chattanooga. They retreat in good order. It's not a rout. They retreat slowly, and they, for the most part, maintain their formation. But they go back to Chattanooga, and for this effort, Thomas is given the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga. He becomes a hero in the North, even in the midst of a defeat.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. I invite you to come along for the ride.
From our sponsors.
The History of North America podcast is a sweeping historical saga of the United States, Canada, and Mexico, from their deep origins to our present epoch. Join me, Mark Vinette, on this exciting, fascinating, epic journey through time, focusing on the compelling, wonderful, and tragic stories of North America's inhabitants, heroes, villains, leaders, environment, and geography. I invite you to come along for the ride.
War has played a key role in the history of the United States, from the nation's founding right down to the present. Wars made the United States independent, kept it together, increased its size, and established it as a global superpower. Hi, I'm James Early, host of the Key Battles of American History podcast. In each episode, I discuss American history through the lens of the most important battles of America's wars. To start listening now, go to parthenonpodcast.com or search Key Battles of American History on your favorite podcasting platform.
Once in a generation, a podcast comes along with the power and eloquence to inspire us all.
This show will entertain you while you wait for that one. Join two best friends, author and former history teacher John Driver and comedian Johnny W. for hilarious and authentic conversations about life, history, culture, faith, and everything in between.
You can listen to Talk About That wherever you find your podcasts or at lifeaudio.com.
The Confederates, sensing their victory, raised a great rebel yell, but Bragg wasn't quite so sure that it was really all that over. It wasn't over, and it wasn't that big of a victory. A Confederate soldier said to him, "Yes, General, we've won a great victory. The Federals are in retreat." Bragg was a really crotchety man. He wasn't that old necessarily, but he had some health issues, and he was just really grumpy and grouchy almost all the time. Bragg says to this man, "Do you know what a retreat looks like?" And the soldier replied, "Yes, General, I ought to know. I have been with you for your whole campaign."
The insult comedy here in the Civil War, I mean, we've lost something that we can't put each other down the way that Lincoln and generals and all these other people are doing. I mean, there has to be a book out there somewhere of all the best burns in the insult sense of the Civil War.
Yeah, now they just cuss each other out, but these guys they very politely and ironically and in fancy words put each other down. "Yes, I've been with you for your whole campaign." All right, so Rosecrans wires Washington. He says, "We have met with a severe disaster." Lincoln said Rosecrans was confused and stunned like a duck hit on the head. Don't you love Lincoln? Lincoln has this folksy, homey way with words, and he always gets straight to the point. I remember reading that at one point, before Rosecrans retreated, he was a Catholic, he was a devout Catholic, and somebody saw him making the sign of the cross, and they said, "That's not a good sign." If the general's making the sign of the cross and asking for God's help, we must be in trouble. So the battle ends. It's a complete disaster for the Union. It's a Confederate major victory. It's the largest battle in the Western theater, and it's the second bloodiest battle in the entire war in terms of total casualties. Gettysburg, we saw, was the first with about 50,000 total casualties. This one's going to have not quite that many, but quite a few. Let's go ahead and spell it out. The Confederates had 18,000 casualties. The Federals had 16,000, and that's significant. Again, even though it's a Confederate victory, they lose more guys. And remember, of course, that the Confederate armies tend to be smaller, so if they lose the same number of the Federals, then that hurts them much worse. This is the biggest Confederate victory in the West for the whole war, and it's the last major Confederate victory anywhere. It's not the last victory, period, but it's the last major Confederate victory. It brings no strategic reward, though. Bragg made no effort to push the Federals further back. So you kicked them out of Georgia. They went back to Chattanooga, but the Union Army is still strong. It's still there. They're going to get a chance to rest and refit. Chattanooga and all of Tennessee is still in Federal hands. So I'm not sure that it accomplished all that much for the Confederacy. What do you think?
Yeah, this is something that, we really have to group these two together, Chickamauga and Chattanooga. So
yeah, they're two sides of the same coin. They really are. That's why we just couldn't skip straight to Chattanooga.
Right. But just in some analysis, when I was looking at how some historians interpret the first part here, Chickamauga, it's interesting because those who are critical of Confederate action here would compare it to early parts of the Civil War, of the Peninsula Campaign or of the Overland Campaign, where the Union could have pressed for a better victory, or they could have done more to take advantage of the situation at hand, but they didn't, and they missed a great opportunity. And James and I have always tried to present the other side, too, that the Confederates had suffered many casualties, so we don't want to be too critical here, but let me just give a couple of those viewpoints, a couple quotes from historians. One by Peter Cozzens says, Bragg had his best chance to crush the Army of the Cumberland and reverse the tide of war in the West, perhaps irrevocably, given the deepening war weariness in the North during the first hours following the Federal flight into Chattanooga. And another historian, James McDonough, says, Bragg failed to take advantage of the disorganized Union Army when its soldiers were despondent in defeat. Instead of attacking and maintaining momentum, Bragg elected to pursue a siege operation in which his enemy supplies were never completely cut off. So the Confederate Army of Tennessee failed to pursue and conquer Rosencran's army, and this led later to a struggle among Bragg and his subordinates about who is to blame. It's not clear-cut that Bragg is at fault here, but one important factor is that everyone does have their eye on 1864, that it's not so much that the Confederacy has to have a resounding victory, but the North has to be dispirited enough or lack enough momentum that Lincoln can lose, a Democrat can win, and then, for all intents and purposes, the Confederacy is home free. So this is something that everyone has in mind, that can we keep the Union Army from having a total knockout victory somewhere? So anyway, that's some historian perspective.
Yeah, Scott and I have said this several times already, but you cannot separate politics and what goes on the battlefield. They are absolutely critical to each other. They're hand in glove. And that's why we will talk a little bit more about politics too, even though this is primarily a military podcast.
Right. Well, hey, we need to wrap up this thing. So in the next episode, we're going to look at what happens at the Battle of Chattanooga. Thanks for listening to the Key Battles in the Civil War podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show in the podcast player of your choice and leave us a rating and a review. This helps us grow and reach new listeners. You can also find maps of the battle sites, show notes to each episode, and plenty of other history info by going to keybattlesinthecivilwar.com.